A truck driver, passing a rainy highway, noticed a homeless woman and her son with nowhere to go. He decided to help, handing them the keys to his house to give them a safe place for the night. But when he walked in later that evening, what he saw left him speechless. Tom stood in the doorway, surveying the chaos of his room, a living monument to countless promises he'd made to himself. Every morning, as the first slivers of sunlight broke through his window, a pang of guilt would strike him over the mess that surrounded him. He'd mentally promised to tidy it up, but the morning rush would quickly erase that resolve. By the time work began, the demands of the day left little room for such thoughts, and every evening, after the grind had left him exhausted, he'd return to that same room. His hand would instinctively reach for the bottle of whiskey waiting on the nightstand. It had become his nightly ritual, the amber liquid offering a temporary escape that quieted his mind long enough for him to slip into a heavy, dreamless sleep. And then the cycle would begin again. In the quiet moments, Tom couldn't avoid the emptiness Emma had left behind. Her departure to chase her dreams in the city had left a hole in his world, a wound he couldn't quite heal. "You can come with me, you know," she had said, her eyes bright with excitement, but he'd only shaken his head, held back by an unspoken fear of the unknown. Now, in her absence, he filled that emptiness with the comforting numbness of whiskey. Each empty bottle that lined his bedside table felt like a badge of unacknowledged sorrow, a quiet testament to the nights spent trying to drown out memories of her laughter echoing through the house. Tom sighed and looked around at the cluttered room. Every pile of clothes, every scattered paper seemed to mock him. They mirrored the tangled emotions he hadn't faced. His promise to clean up had become a metaphor for all the promises he'd made to himself, to move on, to let her go, to start fresh. But somehow, the weight of the past clung to him like chains he couldn't break. At the bustling fair, surrounded by the sounds of carnival rides and families enjoying homemade treats, Tom's world paused the moment he spotted Emma. She was leaning over a stool filled with colorful handmade candles, laughing with a warmth that seemed to brighten everything around her. The sunlight caught her hair, casting a golden glow, and her eyes sparkled with a vibrant energy he hadn't seen before. Almost without realizing it, Tom found himself moving toward her. He pretended to browse the candles with mild interest, but in truth, he was drawn to the lively force she radiated, magnetic in a way that felt as real as gravity. When she finally looked up and noticed him, her eyes lit up with unmistakable joy. "Tom!" she exclaimed, a delighted grin spreading across her face. "Emma," he replied, trying to sound casual, though his heart pounded. Their conversation started with casual remarks about the candles, but soon drifted to favorite fair memories, stories about mutual friends, and dreams for the future. Every word felt effortless, every laugh genuine, as though they had simply picked up where they had last left off. Hours passed, and as the sun set, the fairgrounds were alive with glowing lights and music. Tom knew, deep down, that this wasn't just a chance meeting. It was the beginning of something special. Tom had always carried a quiet magnetism. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a chiseled jawline and deep-set eyes, he possessed a calm, steady strength. His tousled hair gave him a rugged appeal, but there was more to him than his looks. Beneath his exterior, a depth and sensitivity drew people in. It was evident in his thoughtful gaze and the way he listened intently, making others feel truly heard. His voice, smooth and calming, gave his words weight. He made people feel understood. Working on Mr. Harrison's farm, Tom had become more than just a hired hand. He was invaluable. The rich soil yielded generous harvests, but it was Tom's touch that ensured everything, from planting to harvesting, ran smoothly. Every morning before the sun fully rose, he'd be out in the fields, preparing the machinery for the day's work. His connection with the equipment was almost mystical. Tractors, combines, plows. There wasn't a piece of machinery he couldn't master. His understanding was instinctual. He could detect a misfire in an engine's hum or identify a machine's need for adjustment simply by feeling its vibrations. With a single glance or touch, he could coax each machine to peak performance, often solving issues that baffled even seasoned mechanics. To him, the gears and levers were extensions of his own body, a language he understood without needing words. Tom's expertise didn't stay confined to Mr. Harrison's fields for long. Word spread quickly among neighboring farmers, and soon they were coming to him for advice or to watch him work. "He's got a gift," they'd murmur, watching with a mixture of admiration and envy. Some even joked that he dreamed in engine sounds. Though some workers tried to downplay his skills, their awe was undeniable. But Tom remained unaffected by the attention. For all his talent and the quiet respect he earned, he stayed humble, never seeking recognition or boasting. If someone came to him with a problem, he'd lend a hand without hesitation, often working late into the night if needed. One afternoon, as Tom worked on a particularly stubborn tractor engine, Mr. Harrison approached. "Tom," he said, breaking the silence, "I don't know what we'd do without you around here." Tom straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just doing my part, Mr. Harrison," he replied modestly, his eyes cast down to the engine. Mr. Harrison chuckled, clapping Tom on the shoulder. "Well, you've made yourself mighty indispensable, whether you know it or not. You've got away with these machines, and with people too. We're lucky to have you." Tom nodded, his smile lingering as he returned to the engine. He might not admit it out loud, but there was a quiet pride in knowing he belonged somewhere, that his work mattered. Tom's life had been quietly solitary. The woman who had nurtured him, his beloved grandmother, had passed when he was 18. It seemed she'd held on just long enough to guide him through his early years, offering unwavering support until he could stand firmly on his own. Her absence left a hollow space in his heart, but he found strength in knowing she had instilled in him resilience and independence. Growing up, Tom never had parents waiting to embrace him or cheer him on. His mother had a series of relationships that held more allure than the responsibilities of parenthood, and his father chased material success, leaving no room for a son. Tom was a casualty of their pursuits, lost in their worlds of personal ambition. In school, Tom often felt a pang of sadness mixed with frustration as he watched other children cry for their parents at morning drop-offs. These kids would be reunited with their parents by the end of the day, yet they clung to them as if they'd never see them again. Tom never had anyone to cling to. His school years painted him as a man of few words. He didn't engage in idle chatter or seek companionship in large groups. Instead, he found solace in the school's workshop, where the hum of machinery provided a comforting rhythm. His hands moved deftly with tools, breathing life into metal and engines. Mechanics and construction courses were his sanctuary, where the weight of the world faded, replaced by the satisfaction of creating and fixing. Few knew that, behind his reserved exterior, Tom had a deep love for reading, especially about world history. It was his secret pleasure, a private world he could retreat into when away from the clamor of school or the grind of daily life. He'd listen in on heated discussions about politics or historical events, quietly amused as his classmates butchered facts he knew by heart. But he never corrected them, preferring the peace of silence to the noise of debate. After high school, Tom's path was clear. Though he appreciated the humanities, he felt he could absorb them through books. It was hands-on work that truly called to him. He enrolled in a local community college, diving into courses on welding and automotive technology. When Tom chose to return to his quaint hometown after college, many were surprised. Most of his peers were drawn to the city's bright lights and promises of success, but Tom was different. He was content with the steady rhythm of his hometown, a place that felt woven into his bones. He buried himself in his work, seeming immune to romantic overtures. His clear vision was to build a home of his own before marriage. The house he constructed stood as a testament to his skills, solid, practical, and filled with warmth. Tom poured his memories into every nail and plank, determined never to feel the sting of cold or struggle again. Growing up, he had learned to live with little, watching his grandmother skimp on firewood to save money. Tom stood in the doorway, taking in the chaotic mess of his room, a living monument to countless promises he'd made to himself. Every morning, as the first slivers of sunlight broke through his window, he felt a pang of guilt over the disorder surrounding him. He'd mentally note to tidy up, but the rush to prepare for work would quickly erase that resolve, replaced by the demands of the day. By evening, after the grind left him exhausted, he'd return to the same room, his hand instinctively reaching for the bottle of whiskey on the nightstand. It had become his nightly ritual, the amber liquid a temporary escape that quieted his mind just long enough for him to slip into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning, the cycle would begin again. In the quiet moments, Tom couldn't avoid the emptiness that Emma had left behind. Her departure to pursue her dreams in the city had left a hole in his life, a wound he couldn't seem to heal. "You can come with me, you know," she had said, her eyes bright with excitement. But he'd shaken his head, rooted in place by an unspoken fear of the unknown. Now, in her absence, he filled the void with whiskey. Every empty bottle on his nightstand felt like a badge of some unacknowledged sorrow, a quiet testament to the nights spent trying to drown out the memories of her laughter echoing through the house. He sighed, surveying the cluttered room. Each pile of clothes and scattered papers mocked him, mirroring the tangled emotions he hadn't faced. His promise to clean up had become a metaphor for the promises he'd made to himself, to move on, to let her go, to start fresh. But somehow, the weight of the past clung to him, holding him in place like chains he couldn't break. At the bustling fair, surrounded by the clamor of carnival rides and families savoring homemade treats, Tom felt time freeze the moment he spotted Emma. She was leaning over a stool filled with colorful handmade candles, laughing with a warmth that seemed to brighten everything around her. The sunlight caught her hair just right, casting a golden glow, and her eyes sparkled with an energy he hadn't seen before. Without realizing it, Tom found himself moving toward the stool, his gaze fixed on Emma, pretending to browse the candles with mild interest. In truth, he was drawn to the lively force she radiated, a magnetism that felt as real as gravity. When she finally noticed him, her eyes lit up with unmistakable joy. "Tom," she exclaimed, her grin spreading across her face. "Emma," he replied, trying to sound casual, his heart pounding. Their conversation started with casual comments about the candles but quickly shifted to favorite fair memories, stories about mutual friends, and dreams for the future. Every word felt effortless, every laugh genuine, as if they were simply picking up where they'd left off. Hours slipped by as they wandered from stall to stall, talking about everything and nothing, their connection growing with each moment. By sunset, the fairgrounds were alive with glowing lights and music, and Tom knew deep down that this wasn't just a chance encounter. It was the beginning of something special. Tom's presence had always been quietly magnetic, tall and broad-shouldered, with a chiseled jawline and deep-set eyes. He carried himself with calm, steady strength. His hair was tousled in a way that gave him a rugged appeal. But there was more to him than just looks. Beneath his rugged exterior was a depth and sensitivity that drew people in, seen in his thoughtful gaze and the way he listened with genuine attention. Though he rarely laughed, when he did, it was infectious, warming those around him. His voice was smooth and calming, giving his words a weight that made people feel truly heard and understood. Working across the vast expanses of Mr. Harrison's farm, Tom had become more than just a hired hand. He was an invaluable presence. Year after year, the rich soil yielded generous harvests, and it was Tom's touch that ensured the entire process, from planting to harvesting, ran like a well-oiled machine. Each morning, before the sun fully breached the horizon, he'd be out in the fields, methodically inspecting and preparing the machinery for the day's work. His connection to the equipment was almost mystical: tractors, combines, plows. There wasn't a piece of machinery he couldn't master. His understanding was instinctual. He could detect the faintest misfire in an engine's hum or identify a machine's need for adjustment just by feeling its vibrations through his hands. With a single glance or touch, he could coax each piece to peak performance, often solving issues that baffled even seasoned mechanics. To him, the gears and levers felt like extensions of his own body, a language he understood without words. Tom's expertise didn't stay confined to Mr. Harrison's fields for long. Word spread quickly among neighboring farms, and soon, farmers came seeking his advice or simply to watch him work. "He's got a gift," they'd murmur, watching with a mixture of admiration and envy. Some even joked that he dreamed in engine sounds. While some workers tried to downplay his skills, their awe was unmistakable. Yet Tom remained unaffected by the attention. For all his talent and the quiet respect he earned, he stayed humble. He never boasted or sought recognition, preferring to let his work speak for itself. If someone came to him with a problem, he'd lend a hand without hesitation, often working late into the night if needed. One afternoon, as Tom worked on a particularly stubborn tractor engine, Mr. Harrison approached, watching him with a thoughtful look. "Tom," he began, breaking the silence. "I don't know what we'd do without you around here." Tom straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Just doing my part, Mr. Harrison," he replied modestly, eyes cast down to his work. Mr. Harrison chuckled, clapping Tom on the shoulder. "Well, you've made yourself mighty indispensable, whether you know it or not. You've got away with these machines, and with people, too. We're lucky to have you." Tom nodded, his smile lingering as he returned to the engine. He might not admit it out loud, but there was quiet pride in knowing he belonged somewhere, that his work mattered to people. Tom lived a quiet, solitary existence. His beloved grandmother, who had nurtured him, passed away just as he reached adulthood. At 18, it seemed as though she'd held on just long enough to see him through his early years, guiding him until he could stand firmly on his own. Her absence left a hollow space in his heart, but he found strength in knowing she had instilled in him resilience and independence. At school, Tom often felt a pang of sadness, mixed with frustration, as he watched other children cry at morning drop-offs. Each tearful goodbye puzzled him. These kids would be reunited with their parents by day's end, yet they clung to them as if they'd never see them again. Tom never had parents waiting to embrace him or cheer him on. No one ever explained why he didn't live with either of them, but as he grew older, the reasons became painfully clear. His mother had a string of relationships that held more allure than the responsibilities of parenthood, and his father chased material success and fleeting connections that left no room for a son. He was a casualty of their pursuits, lost in their worlds of personal ambition. Throughout school, Tom was known as a man of few words. He didn't engage in idle chatter or seek the companionship of large groups. Instead, he found solace in the school's workshop, where the hum of machinery provided a comforting rhythm. His hands moved deftly with tools, making intricate adjustments and breathing life into metal and engines. Mechanics and construction were his escape, a sanctuary where he could escape the weight of the world, replaced by the satisfaction of creating and fixing what others couldn't. Though he rarely shared it, Tom had a deep love for reading, especially about world history. It was his secret pleasure, a private world he could retreat into whenever he needed an escape from the clamor of school or daily life. He would listen in on his classmates' heated debates about politics or history, quietly amused as they butchered facts he knew by heart. Yet he never corrected them, preferring the peace of silence to the noise of debate. After high school, Tom's path was clear. Though he appreciated the humanities, he preferred learning at his own pace. It was hands-on work that called to him, so he enrolled in a local community college, immersing himself in courses on welding and automotive technology. When Tom chose to return to his quaint hometown after college, many were surprised. Most of his peers flocked to the city, drawn by the bright lights and promises of success. But Tom was different. He was content with the steady, familiar rhythm of his hometown, the sense of place that felt woven into his bones. He buried himself in his work, seemingly immune to romantic overtures and distractions. He had a clear vision: to build a home of his own. Before he even considered marriage, he constructed a house that stood as a testament to his skills, solid, practical, and filled with warmth. Tom poured his memories into every nail and plank, determined never to feel the sting of cold or struggle again. Growing up, he had learned to live with little, watching his grandmother skimp on firewood to save money, leaving their home perpetually chilly. Building his own house was a promise to himself to leave those days behind. The day he first saw Emma felt like the turning of a page in his life. She was vibrant, full of life, and her presence stirred something in him he hadn't realized was dormant. As they began dating, Tom found himself captivated by her energy and laughter. Their love blossomed quickly, and soon they were talking about marriage. For Emma, Tom was a rare find, a kind-hearted man who embodied stability and care, a breath of fresh air from the demanding life she led with her family's responsibilities. He was her chance to break free from the small-town life she'd always felt confined by. Tom, infatuated and devoted, made every effort to fulfill her dreams, providing her with small luxuries she'd never known before. Emma quickly grew accustomed to this new life. Tom never hesitated to buy her what she wanted, spoiling her in ways she hadn't expected. He was a near-perfect spouse, handling everything with quiet determination and making sure she never had to worry. As the months went by, Emma began to withdraw from household responsibilities, casually tossing out reasons like protecting her skin or simply not feeling up to it. Tom took it in stride, never pushing her, assuming these were small sacrifices he'd gladly make for her comfort. In his eyes, she was the love of his life, the only person left who mattered deeply to him, and he'd do anything to make her happy. For 3 years, Tom and Emma lived their quiet life, with Tom giving everything he had to make her comfortable. Then one day, Emma confronted him out of the blue. "Tom, how long are we going to be stuck here?" she demanded, arms folded tightly. "Everyone's moving on, heading to the city. We're just languishing in this village." Tom blinked, taken aback. "I never said I wanted to move to the city, Emma. And you haven't either. Why bring this up now?" Emma's voice sharpened. "I don't want to waste my whole life here, Tom. I hope you're not planning to keep me here forever." Tom raised an eyebrow, confusion growing. "I don't understand. This is where we started our life together. We have everything we need here, don't we?" Emma began pacing the room, rolling her eyes. "My God, Tom, you sound like an old man. Don't you want more than this? Let's get out of here. See the world. Go to theaters for heaven's sake." The conversation escalated quickly, and Tom's frustration finally bubbled over. He snapped, "You're acting like a princess on a pea." The words hung in the air between them, harsh and stinging. Without another word, he stormed out, needing to cool off. They made amends later, but the subject lingered in the unspoken space between them, never resolved. Unbeknownst to Tom, Emma had known he'd never leave town. In fact, she'd been counting on it, and this argument was just the beginning of her exit plan. 3 weeks after their confrontation, Tom came home to an empty house. Her clothes were gone, and a note was waiting for him on the kitchen counter. "I need to follow my dreams, Tom. Don't wait up." It felt like the ground had fallen out from under him. Tom squinted, trying to make out her face in the dim light. She looked so young, barely an adult, thin and worn down. Her tired eyes told a story of days, maybe even weeks, of hardship. His gaze shifted to the boy huddled against her side, no more than 5, shivering and clinging to her. Tom glanced at his watch, calculating his options. It was late enough that he doubted any place in town would be open to help them. They drove in silence for a few minutes until they reached his house. Pulling into the driveway, Tom took a deep breath and reached into his pocket. With a firm but hesitant resolve, he pulled out his house keys and handed them to her. "That's my house, just over there," he said, nodding toward it. "Take these keys. I'll be back after 6. The place should be warm, but if it's cold, you can stoke the stove. There might be some food in the kitchen. I can't promise much, and it's a mess, but it'll get you through the night." The woman's eyes widened, the keys in her hand as if she couldn't believe his offer. "You're just giving us your house," she stammered. Tom shrugged, trying to brush off the gesture. "It's just for the day. You look like you need it more than I do right now." With that, he left them standing there, watching as he drove off toward the parking lot. Strangely, he didn't give a second thought to the potential risks. In that moment, his instinct to help, born from an understanding of loneliness and hardship, outweighed any fear or caution. The day drifted by in a fog for Tom, each hour blending into the next. It was only in the evening, on his usual path to the liquor store, that a flicker of unease struck him. He bought his standard half-liter of whiskey, but after a moment's hesitation, added a small bag of candies to the purchase. He couldn't shake the thought of the young boy from that morning, shivering and clinging to his mother. As Tom neared his home, he noticed a warm glow from the windows, an uncommon sight that made his heart tighten. He tread lightly and peeked through the window, unsure of what to expect. To his amazement, his usually cluttered and dusty living room was immaculate. Each item was in its place, the familiar chaos replaced by a cozy order he hadn't seen in years. On the couch, wrapped in a blanket, the young woman sat with the boy beside her, both immersed in one of his old children's books. A lump formed in Tom's throat as he watched them, memories of a time when he had dreamed of a family with Emma Rose surfacing, bittersweet and raw. He had bought those very books years ago, intending to read them to children of his own. When Emma left, he hadn't been able to throw them out, though they'd done nothing but gather dust. Seeing someone actually reading them filled him with a quiet ache he hadn't expected. Then, the scent of home-cooked food reached him, warm and savory, stirring memories he hadn't revisited in ages. He suddenly realized how long it had been since his house had smelled of anything but dust and disuse. Glancing at the whiskey bottle, Tom buried it deep in the snow outside before heading inside. The young woman sprang up as he entered, her cheeks flushed with surprise and a hint of embarrassment. "Hello," she stammered. I hope you don't mind. Johnny and I tidied up a bit, and I made us some dinner. You look like you could use it." Tom blinked, momentarily speechless, taking in the woman who, just that morning, had seemed like nothing more than a lost soul on the side of the road. Now she stood before him, not just grateful but with an unmistakable warmth and grace he hadn't anticipated. "Dinner sounds great," he said, managing a smile. "I'm starving, actually." As she set the table, Tom crouched down to the boy's level, extending a hand. "I'm Tom. What's your name, big man?" he asked warmly. The boy gave a small, shy smile as he shook Tom's hand. "Johnny," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Well, here you go, Johnny," Tom said, handing him a candy bar. "Kids love sweets, don't they?" Johnny's eyes lit up as he glanced at the woman beside him, who gave him a gentle nod of approval. Only then did he accept the treat with a quiet "thank you." Settling at the table, Tom breathed in the aroma of the steaming broth in front of him, savoring it. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the warmth of the food sink in. When he finished his meal, he looked up, meeting the young woman's gaze. She watched him expectantly, as though awaiting his response. "That was incredible," he said, genuinely appreciative. "I can't remember the last time I had a home-cooked meal like this." She offered a modest smile. "Thank you. It's the least we could do, after all you've done for us." A flicker of hesitation crossed her face. "Perhaps it's time for us to move on," she murmured, her voice laced with uncertainty. "We've already stayed too long." Tom raised his eyebrows, surprised. "Are you in a hurry to get somewhere?" She shook her head, her eyes dropping to the table. "No, we don't really have anywhere urgent to go." Silence settled between them, and Tom felt the weight of it. He didn't know how to tell her that she didn't have to leave, not yet. She didn't need to keep looking for a place to stay, not when his home, quiet, empty, and in need of warmth, could provide them with that. After dinner, Johnny's eyelids were drooping, and Tom could tell the boy was ready to fall asleep. He offered to show them to the spare room, and she gently led Johnny, who leaned against her, down the hallway. When she returned after putting him to bed, Tom remained at the table, pouring tea into 2 cups. He handed one to her with a nod, which she accepted, wrapping her hands around the mug. "Thank you," she said softly, her large, vivid blue eyes meeting his as she sat down. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence no longer awkward but filled with unspoken understanding. "So, Scarlett, is it?" Tom asked, finally breaking the quiet, trying to ease into conversation. She nodded. "Yes, and thank you again, Tom. I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't come along." He took a sip of his tea, feeling a strange sense of contentment settle over him. "I'm glad I did. You two are welcome here for as long as you need," he said, surprising even himself with the offer. Scarlett's eyes widened, her expression softening. "That's very generous of you," she replied, her voice almost a whisper. Tom simply nodded. "Please don't get me wrong," Scarlett began, her voice tentative as she stared into her tea. "We ended up like this because, well, life took a challenging turn for me." Tom nodded, listening carefully. "I was in school when I met a guy, thought I could trust him. It was a mistake, but I don't regret it because it gave me Johnny." She looked toward the closed door of the spare room, a faint smile on her lips. "When I went back home, my mother had a new boyfriend. He was younger, and she wasn't exactly thrilled about my return. I didn't realize it at the time, but I think she was worried about what her boyfriend thought." She paused, taking a deep breath. "Things seemed to settle a little after Johnny was born, but it wasn't easy. I couldn't really work while taking care of him, and relying on my mother for everything made me feel trapped. Then, her boyfriend decided she was too old for him and thought I was a better match. I rejected him, of course, but somehow my mom found out. She blamed me for it all. Before I knew it, I was out on the street with Johnny." Tom stirred his tea slowly, his expression pensive. He could see the weariness in her face, the shadows of a difficult past she carried quietly. He set his cup down, looking at her with calm determination. "Scarlett, he said gently. Why don't you stay here a while? Just until we figure something out. I'm rarely ever home and the place, well, it's been empty for a long time. I'll do what I can to help you get back on your feet. Scarlett looked up, surprise and gratitude flickering in her eyes. Are you sure? I don't want to intrude. Tom shook his head. You're not intruding. Honestly, it's nice to have some life back in this place. And I'll see if there's anyone in town who can help with your situation over the next week. Tom's routine shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. His usual evening ritual of whiskey was nearly forgotten, replaced by evenings spent with Johnny, crafting small projects or reading aloud from the dusty books that had once gathered on his shelves. There was a new warmth in his home, something he hadn't felt in years. A sense of family, of purpose, that he hadn't known he'd missed so deeply. The Careys were pleasantly surprised to see the change in Tom. He'd come by one afternoon with a warm apple pie, courtesy of Scarlett, to thank them for everything. Linda could hardly believe her eyes. Tom was smiling and even laughing as he explained that, thanks to their job offer, he'd met Scarlett and her son Johnny. The Careys exchanged pleased glances, happy to see him returning to his old self. At home, Tom's once empty house now felt warm and alive. Scarlett filled it with laughter, the scent of delicious dinners, and Johnny's bright energy brought a new joy to each day. It was the life Tom had always dreamed of. Yet, a quiet sadness lingered. He knew it could be fleeting, a gift that might not be his to keep forever. One evening, after a long day at work, he stopped by the store to pick up a few things. The shopkeeper, an older woman with a knowing smile, leaned over the counter, eyes twinkling. So, she's back, huh? Tom frowned, taken aback. Who's back? What are you talking about? Oh, you didn't know, she said, surprised. Emma. She was here a couple of hours ago. Tom felt the color drain from his face. Without another word, he dropped his groceries and bolted out of the store. His heart pounded as he thought of Scarlett and Johnny. He sped home, dread pooling in his stomach. Bursting through the door, he stopped cold at the sight of Emma lounging on his sofa, a smirk on her face. She struck a seductive pose, her eyes glinting with a mixture of resentment and amusement. Tom's voice was thick with panic as he demanded, "Where are they?" Emma, ever composed, crossed her arms and pouted, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Hello. Don't you care that I'm back? Aren't you excited?" Her confidence was palpable, sure of the effect she had on him. But Tom's face was hard, his jaw set. He strode toward her, his voice low but full of intensity. "I asked you, where are Scarlett and Johnny?" Emma's eyes widened as he grabbed her arm, her defiance evaporating instantly. "How would I know?" she stammered. "They probably left, back to wherever they came from." Tom, feeling a rush of frustration, released her and turned toward the door, his jaw clenched. "When I come back, I don't want to see you here," he said coldly, not sparing her a single glance. Emma watched him, shock written all over her face. She had expected him to be overjoyed at her return, confident that he would never truly let her go after all. She had once been everything to him. But without a word, Tom stormed out, panic tightening around his chest. Scarlett and Johnny could have been gone for over an hour. Darkness had fallen over the town, and desperation gnawed at him. Where could they have gone? He sprinted to the Careys' house, hoping they might know something. The moment he explained, Linda didn't hesitate. She pressed the keys into his hand. "Here, take it. Let us know if you need anything else," she said, her voice urgent. "Thank you, Mrs. Carey." "I'll be quick," Tom replied, his voice tight with worry. The cold air bit at him as he drove through the town, knowing there weren't many places left to check. The truck stop at the edge of town seemed the most likely destination, so he headed there. As he pulled up, he saw them through the window, two familiar figures huddled together in the warmth of the diner. Tom rushed in, his heart pounding as he reached for Johnny's tiny hands, relieved to find them still warm. "Scarlett, what were you thinking?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. "Didn't you think about Johnny?" Without another word, he pulled them into an embrace, Scarlett's tears spilling onto his shoulder as she clung to him. "I'm so sorry, Tom," she whispered. "She said she was your wife, that you loved her more than anything. I didn't want to ruin your life. Please forgive me." A wave of anger rose in Tom, but he focused on the safety of Scarlett and Johnny, holding them tightly. He ordered hot drinks to calm his nerves, then began explaining everything. The lies Emma had told, the betrayal, and how everything had changed when Scarlett and Johnny entered his life. Scarlett murmured apologies, but Tom only hugged them tighter, his relief overwhelming. On the drive back, the car was silent, but Tom's mind was anything but. A sense of clarity washed over him. He knew, without a doubt, that he would do whatever it took to protect them. As he glanced at Scarlett in the rearview mirror, a warmth bloomed in his chest. This was the life he had longed for, even if he hadn't known how to ask her to stay. He realized, more than ever, that he couldn't imagine them being anywhere else but with him. Back at the house, Emma's confident demeanor had faded, replaced by a cold, calculating air. She glanced around, clearly aware that she was unwelcome. Tom gently asked Scarlett to take Johnny to his room and read him a book, shielding them from the confrontation about to unfold. As soon as they were out of earshot, Emma wasted no time. "Tom, please, let's try again. I know I made a huge mistake. I didn't realize what I had until I lost it," she said, her voice filled with desperation. Tom crossed his arms, his expression calm but firm. "Emma, how could you even think of coming back here after everything you put me through?" She faltered but pressed on. "I realized what I lost, Tom. The money I took didn't last long. The life I thought I'd have wasn't real. The millionaire boyfriend? He's in debt. I'm living with my mother now, scraping by. I know I messed up. Can you forgive me? Let's start over." Tom shook his head, his voice resolute. "I loved you, Emma. More than you'll ever know. You left me at my lowest, and it took everything I had to heal. I'm sorry, but I can't go back." Emma's expression hardened, shifting from pleading to defiant. "Fine," she snapped. "But just so you know, we're still legally married. That means I'm entitled to stay in this house. Legally, I have every right. And if I'm here, they," she pointed towards Scarlett and Johnny's room, "have no right to stay. I can have them kicked out." Tom hadn't expected this. His outrage flared as he watched Emma's demeanor change, cold and calculating. "This is my house, Emma," he said firmly. "I built it with my own hands. You left me, and you have nothing to do with it anymore. Do you really want to go down this road?" Emma narrowed her eyes, knowing that splitting the house legally would be a long and costly battle. But jealousy gnawed at her. The thought of Scarlett, a stranger, having taken her place was unbearable. Her expression turned vindictive. "Oh, I'll make it worth my while," she sneered. "I'll drag you to court if I have to, and don't think I won't make up whatever stories I need to." Tom felt a chill as the threat sank in. The last thing he wanted was a messy court battle, filled with rumors and accusations that would turn him into the town's latest gossip. As he looked around the house, he realized how many things in it reminded him of his painful past with Emma. Fighting her over this place seemed like fighting ghosts. A strange calm settled over him. "You can have the house, Emma," he said softly but firmly. "I'll move somewhere else. Start over. This place isn't worth dragging my life through the mud for. I won't give you the satisfaction." Emma's jaw dropped. She hadn't expected him to give in so easily. She wanted him to fight, to argue, to sink to her level. But his unexpected decision threw her off balance. She stammered, struggling for words. "Just give me a few days," she begged. "I need time to make arrangements." "I need time too," Tom said, his tone unshaken. "But we'll be gone soon." Without another word, he left the house and headed to the Careys, returning their truck keys and sharing the situation with them. Linda and Ben were taken aback by his resolve, but after Tom left, they exchanged a look. They knew what needed to be done. The next morning, Emma awoke to find Tom and Scarlett quietly packing their things, the silence between them filled with purpose. Tom's decision wasn't a bluff. When a knock at the door interrupted the quiet morning, Tom went to answer it, finding Mr. and Mrs. Carey standing outside with a plate of pancakes in hand. They greeted Emma with polite but distant nods before heading to the kitchen to join Tom, Scarlett, and Johnny for breakfast. Ben's face grew serious as he turned to Tom. "Why don't you bring your new family and come stay with us for a while, until you figure things out?" Emma froze, listening from the living room. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. It was as if Tom had slipped through her grasp, and now the very people she had expected to support her were welcoming Scarlett and Johnny instead. 2 days later, Emma sat by the window, watching Tom and little Johnny shoveling snow together in the yard. Life in the house had changed. Tom returned to work, and Scarlett cared for Ben and Linda, who were both ill. Meanwhile, Emma was left alone, her isolation growing as her anger turned inward. As the days passed, Emma's health began to deteriorate. At first, she ignored the sharp pains in her stomach, brushing them off as stress. But the pain only grew worse. Weeks later, Emma received devastating news from her doctor: a tumor in her stomach. Her health declined rapidly, her once confident demeanor wilting as the illness took hold. No one noticed until the day an ambulance arrived outside. Scarlett, who was at the Careys' house, rushed over concerned. After the medics left, she knocked on Emma's door but received no response. With a tentative push, she found the door unlocked and entered. There, in the bed, Emma lay pale and weak, breathing labored. Scarlett fetched her a glass of water and sat beside her, sensing the need for quiet comfort. "Does your mother know?" Scarlett asked softly, unsure of what to say. Emma's eyes filled with a quiet, regretful emotion. "No," she whispered. "She doesn't want anything to do with me anymore." They sat in silence, the unspoken connection between them fragile but real, born not from friendship, but from shared humanity. In the final months of Emma's life, it was this quiet understanding that lingered, even in the face of her bitterness and pain. Scarlett had never expected to take on such a role in life, but fate had a way of pushing her toward things she hadn't anticipated. As Emma's health deteriorated, Scarlett found herself taking on the role of caregiver, something she had never imagined doing for someone like Emma. The woman who had once been so strong, so confident, and even cold in her pursuit of her desires, had slowly turned into someone who needed constant care. Gone were the sharp edges of Emma's bitterness, replaced with a quiet resignation. She was no longer the woman who would throw her weight around or demand attention. Emma had become vulnerable in a way that Scarlett could never have predicted. The anger that had once seemed like a permanent fixture in Emma's personality had faded, and in its place was a quiet sadness, a vulnerability Scarlett could see clearly despite the layers Emma had tried to build around herself. Every day, Scarlett found herself sitting by her side, comforting her in small ways. Whether it was offering a glass of water, helping her dress, or simply sitting in silence, letting Emma feel the presence of someone who genuinely cared. Scarlett had grown fond of her, perhaps because she saw in Emma a brokenness that was all too familiar to her own experience. Despite the complicated history between them, Scarlett's compassionate heart did not allow her to turn away. She understood that Emma's journey was filled with regrets, and though Emma had never been one to express gratitude directly, there was an unspoken understanding between them. They didn't need words to acknowledge the shift that had occurred. The walls of the house, once filled with tension and conflict, now reverberated with an unexpected sense of peace. Tom, ever supportive, often drove Scarlett and Emma to medical appointments, silently standing by her side as she faced the harsh reality of the situation. He knew the gravity of what Scarlett had taken on, and though he had never vocalized it, his actions spoke louder than any words could. Every time Emma's health took a turn for the worse, Tom was there, offering his help, his understanding, and his unconditional support. Though Emma rarely expressed her appreciation out loud, it became evident over time that she had a certain respect for the way Scarlett had become her anchor. There was a tenderness in Emma's eyes when she looked at Scarlett now, a softness that had once been buried beneath layers of pride and bitterness. For all the hurt Emma had caused in the past, Scarlett had found a way to forgive her. The day of the funeral was an emotional one, not just for the loss of Emma's life but also for the many years of pain that had been carried by all involved. Tom walked through the empty house that once echoed with arguments, misunderstandings, and unresolved pain. He looked around, taking in the quiet stillness that now filled the rooms. He felt a deep sadness, not just for Emma's life, which had been cut short by illness, but for all the lost years. As Tom stood there, his mind flooded with memories of the choices they had all made, choices that had led them to this point. The pain each of them carried had been buried deep inside. But now, standing in the empty house, he could no longer ignore the lessons that life had taught them, often at great cost. It was clear to him now that the greatest lessons in life often came at the expense of hardship, regret, and loss. And yet, he understood that those very lessons were what had shaped him, what had shaped them all. Tom realized that he had spent so much of his life clinging to what was familiar, to what had once been a dream that no longer existed. He had learned the hard way that sometimes the best thing you can do is let go of the past and move forward. It wasn't about erasing the memories, but about accepting that the people who truly mattered in his life were the ones who had stood by him when things were at their lowest. He had spent too long chasing something that no longer served his happiness, and now it was time to cherish those who truly cared for him. As winter melted into spring, life began anew for Tom, Scarlett, and little Johnny. The changes in their lives were gradual but unmistakable. The once cold, sterile house now echoed with laughter and warmth. Tom and Johnny worked together to repaint the walls of the house. It was a bonding experience for them, one that brought them closer together. The sound of their voices, filled with jokes and playful banter, was a stark contrast to the silence that had once consumed the space. Scarlett, who had a noticeable bump growing in her belly, was often near them, assisting when she could or teasing them for missing spots. Despite her growing exhaustion from the pregnancy, Scarlett kept herself busy. She prepared meals, took care of household chores, and made sure the family ran smoothly. It was a balance of taking care of everyone and still being there for herself. She wasn't just taking care of the house, she was nurturing the relationships that had become the foundation of her new life. There were days when she felt overwhelmed, but when she looked around at the family she had found, she couldn't help but feel a sense of pride and gratitude. The days were filled with small moments of joy, Tom and Johnny making the house their own, Scarlett's hands resting lovingly on her belly as she smiled at her growing family, and the simple pleasure of sitting together at the dinner table, sharing a meal. For the first time in years, there was peace. There was warmth. There was love. It wasn't the life that Tom had originally envisioned, but it was a life that was more fulfilling than anything he could have imagined in his wildest dreams. Linda and Ben Carey, who had never had children of their own, had taken to their role as surrogate grandparents with enthusiasm. They showered Johnny with love and attention, eagerly awaiting the arrival of Scarlett and Tom's new baby. They became a part of the family in a way that felt completely natural. The love and support they offered was immeasurable, and Tom, Scarlett, and Johnny could always count on them to be there when they needed a helping hand. One evening, they all gathered around the dinner table, which had become their second home. The air was thick with conversation and laughter, a far cry from the silence that had once haunted the house. Linda, looking over at Scarlett and Tom, smiled softly. Reaching for Ben's hand, she said, "You know, I think we always hoped to have a family, but we never imagined it would turn out this way. You three are a blessing we never saw coming." Tom nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "You two have been more than family to us," he said, his words heartfelt. "We wouldn't have gotten through any of this without you." Johnny, who had been beaming with happiness all evening, raised his glass of milk high, announcing to the room, "To family." His words were met with a round of laughter, and for a moment, it felt as if everything in the world was just as it should be. Later that night, as Tom and Scarlett settled into bed, Scarlett rested her hand on her growing belly and looked over at Tom with a gentle smile. "I never thought life would turn out like this," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "After everything, it's hard to believe we're here, together, building a future." Tom wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. He kissed the top of her head, murmuring, "We're here because we found each other when we needed it most." He smiled as he looked at her, a smile that spoke of hope and happiness. "And now I can't imagine life any other way." In that small, cozy house surrounded by the love of their family and friends, Tom, Scarlett, and Johnny began a new chapter in their lives. It was a chapter that was rooted not in the pain of the past, but in the hope of everything yet to come. As spring bloomed around them, they stepped into a future filled with promise, love, and a newfound peace that had once seemed out of reach. The hardships they had faced had shaped them, yes, but it was the love they had found that had truly defined them. Together, they were stronger than any past regret or pain could ever hold. If you had fun with this story, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more awesome content. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm excited to know what you think. Let's build this community together.